Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're talking about building ability rotations. We touched on this topic a bit in the basic DPS videos, but in those videos we mostly focused on the ultimate ability rotations, and in particular how we ordered our threshold abilities within the ultimate, and we were kind of operating under the assumption that Revolution was using our basic abilities for us. In this video we'll be taking a much more general look at the principles of building an ability rotation so that you'll be able to improvise one for yourself for any length of time and under any conditions. Ultimately, our goal is not to memorize the best ability rotation, it's to get good at improvising ability rotations so that we can adapt them to different boss mechanics or different team formats. This may seem like a very daunting topic, but the basics are remarkably simple when you break them down in a particular way. If we take the abilities on screen right now, all of these listed have a 5-second cooldown apart from Bash, though we do have JMod confirmation that Bash is being changed to a 5-second cooldown at some point in the future, which is why it's included. These abilities all deal moderate damage, about halfway between the weak abilities available and the strong ones, but because of their remarkably short cooldown they can be used every 3 abilities, and thus are going to provide the framework for our ability rotations as we build them. Most of these abilities also have a passive buff of some kind attached to them, and we'll talk about maximizing the utility of those later in the video. When I say that these abilities build the framework of your ability rotation, I mean that in a very literal and almost universal sense. They can be used every 3 abilities, and you will use them every 3 abilities in almost every single circumstance in game. This gives us a great head start on our ability rotation by separating things into groups of 3 abilities. Let's zoom in on one particular group of 3 abilities, see if we can analyze some of the properties that will be present here, and decide how to fill in the ability slots. The first thing we can do is plug in the 5-second cooldown ability, and for this example we'll just be talking about dual wield ranged. The ability in this case is Needle Strike, which is one of the many that provides a buff to the next ability used, in this case 7% increased damage. Like most types of buffs, this doesn't apply to damage over time abilities, so we definitely know we don't want to be using one of those in this slot. Instead we will choose something more conventional that also still deals a high damage. You should have a good idea of which abilities would fit well in this slot based on the basic DPS videos, and just for this example I'll be using Snapshot. From here we only have one remaining slot to fill out, and so the obvious choice is to fill that with one of those strong abilities that we didn't want to use in the previous slot because it lacked the ability to gain that buff. For ranged, both Corruption Shot and Fragmentation Shot are a perfect fit for this slot, although you can replace it with a conventional ability as well if there's an alternative reason that you didn't want to be using a damage over time ability. For example, if you're under the effect of Death Swiftness, or if you're on a large team of rangers and competing for bleeds. Before we move on, the last property we should think about in these triplets is how they impact our adrenaline. Let's say for example that we fill out this triplet model using only basic abilities by replacing Snapshot with a strong basic like our Flanking Switch basic Stun. Each of these abilities obviously gives us 8% adrenaline for a net total of 24%, meaning that 4 of these sets of 3 abilities is almost guaranteed to be enough to get us from 0% to 100% to use our ultimate with when you consider the adrenaline you gain from the auto attack when engaging combat as well as perks like Impatient. This is the sort of patterning we'll be using almost any time we're outside of our damage boosting ultimate ability while we're trying to build adrenaline. If instead we use a pattern of 2 basics and 1 threshold, the basics give us a total of 16% adrenaline, and the threshold costs us 15% for a net gain of 1%, meaning this pattern of 3 including a threshold can be cycled indefinitely. This kind of a pattern, with 2 basics and 1 threshold, is the sort of thing we'll be doing while under the effect of our damage boosting ultimate ability. The last potentially interesting format that we can use here involves using the channeled ability for any of these attack styles. In the case of range this would be Rapid Fire, but this would also work with Assault, Destroy, or Asphyxiate. Because of the extended duration on these abilities, they can be used to occupy 2 slots, and so the use of just this alongside our 5-second cooldown ability can fill out one of our triplet sets based on the pattern we've been using. Hopefully you agree that these are some pretty easy principles to remember, and alongside the things that we learned about our abilities in the basic DPS videos, we can throw together an example rotation if, let's say, we were building from 0 to 100% adrenaline at the beginning of combat. All we really need to do from here is make small adjustments based on that aforementioned knowledge. If, for example, we can't get behind an enemy in order to use our flanking switch, then we wouldn't want to include the basic stuns, for example. Now that we have a solid grasp of how these patterns work, however, making these small adjustments to fit the circumstances of combat should be relatively easy. Now before we wrap up, we can get a bit more meticulous about how we utilize the buffs from the 4 abilities listed. What I said earlier in the video, as well as how it's stated on the ability tooltips, is that these effects apply to your next attack. However, technically speaking, this isn't quite correct. These buffs are actually active for 2 game ticks after that next attack, so by using our abilities in a particular way under some circumstances we can create combos that allow these buffs to affect multiple hits. The first and simplest of these combos is just following these abilities with either Hurricane, Snapshot, or Wild Magic depending on which style you're using. Despite each of these thresholds being 2 attacks, because both of them occur within that small time frame, each of them is going to get the buff from their respective 5-second cooldown ability. The second combo involves the ranged ability Snipe, which is unlike other abilities in that instead of dealing its damage at the beginning of the global cooldown after used, it's charged up and dealt at the very end, which means the hit from Snipe can actually stack on top of the damage from whichever ability you use following Snipe. This means pretty much any ability that you use after Snipe is also going to benefit from the damage buff of Needle Strike, assuming that it would normally, obviously excluding things like damage over time abilities. This can even be done with Snapshot like we discussed in the previous example, and you get the buff on Snipe as well as both hits of Snapshot. The last interesting combo that I'm aware of with ranged involves using Shadow Tendrils, and as we discussed in the ranged DPS basics video, there are ways to apply an auto attack on top of the Tendril ability. Because the auto attack and the Tendril damage occur together, the Needle Strike buff is going to apply to both of them. The last interesting combo that comes to mind is another one that we discussed in a DPS basics video, and it applies to magic. As we demonstrated in that video, you can get an auto attack as well as the damage from Detonate and whatever ability you use following Detonate to apply to the enemy in that time frame, and thus get the buff from either Sonic Wave or Concentrated Blast to apply to all of it. This combo is likely a bit less useful than the other ones, however it still plays a big role at bosses where Detonate is important, like Virago and Telos. Thanks for watching, guys. This is essentially a remake of a video I made previously, but I wanted to expand and clarify on some of the information, so if it seems familiar, that's probably why. As usual, if any of you guys have questions, please drop them in the comment section down below and I'll try to answer them for you. Huge thanks to my Patreon supporters who are always a massive help. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.